Ladies and gentlemen, with me right now on the Day Trade Show is the one and the only, the Tai Chi Master, David Morgan. David, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Are you a Tai Chi Master?
Don, I've just started. I've probably got about 3 or 4 months into the practice, but I like it so far, and I think it's going to achieve what I want, which is a little flexibility at my ripe old age.
So you're doing it for exercise purposes?
Yes, it has 2 components, really. There's the exercise benefit, and then, of course, there is the martial arts aspect. But I'm putting the martial arts aspect of it on hold for a while and just doing it as an exercise practice.
Is there also a philosophical component with Tai Chi?
Absolutely. It's inner work as well as an outer work. And if you're not willing to be, let's say, within yourself as you're doing the practice, you may as well do, Zumba dance or do some aerobics or...
Hey, the Zumba. That's good stuff. Watch out now.
I'm not putting it down. I'm just making a comparison. That's all. If all you want is physical activity, then you should probably look somewhere else. If you want to have a practice that integrates the head, heart, and body, all 3 aspects, then you might look at something like Tai Chi. It's just a contrast I was making. I'm not a big Zumba fan, but I don't know anything about it. It looks kind of cool, actually.
Okay. Given that you're generally an expert on gold and silver, something else with more than one component. I've heard you talk about the different components, the fundamental, the technical, and all that. Is there any correlation? I'm not trying to make too hard of a segue here. Is there any correlation in your philosophical beliefs and your beliefs in precious metals?
Well, that's a great question, and certainly it's a first, so I commend you for that, Don. I would say yes, and as you were asking a question, I was trying to kind of dig deep. The answer is, philosophically, the market itself, humankind, if you will, has determined that gold, primarily silver as well, are the money of choice. In fact, I got to reverse myself from what I just said. Really, the choice by the people has been silver as the primary money throughout history, and gold, secondly, as a kind of a 2-tiered system, meaning that gold is used internationally to settle, nation state to nation state. Certainly there were gold coins, certainly people traded in gold, certainly you could buy things with gold, and that's not making that comment. What I'm commenting on is that most of the transactions throughout history, when we were on a precious metal standard, and most countries were at one time or another, silver was the metal that was used. In fact, if you go back to the Jim Blanchard conferences many, many years ago, Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate, was asked, what is the history of money? He said, silver is the money of history, not gold. And that's indirect quote, but that's what he said. So silver certainly is an important monetary metal, or has been. Gold certainly is an important monetary metal. But I think, again, it gets back to the why. And the why is because that's what people have chosen. And why have they chosen it? Well, it maintains all of the aspects that money has held according to what Aristotle said money should have. And that's a unit of account, so you can count with it. It's a means of exchange, so you can trade with it. But more importantly, what's missing from our modern money is it is a store of value, so that at whatever point in time, there is a value associated with this that really isn't necessarily constant. The value of it does change up and down, but it has more of a value that's good indefinitely. There's roughly been 3,500 fiat currencies or paper currencies that have been non-backed, and all of them have failed. So the failure rate is 100% up until this point in time, Don, as you well know. And right now, if you look at the Federal Reserve's own data, when the dollar started at 100 in 1913, their data shows you that a current dollar from 100 years ago, roughly 101, is worth 4 cents. So that dollar, and the mandate really is to maintain a stable monetary policy. And I said, great job, gentlemen. That's a direct quote from one of my very early articles. So it's lost 96%. And people still don't seem to get it. They still seem.
I think you're a little kind on 96%. I think it's more like 97, but
it could be 97, and I think that has to be, if I could interject, and you're right on track, is that's using their data. I mean, that's using the data that we only have 2% inflation right now. So, I mean, if you factor, a more, let's say, pragmatic look at it, it's probably worse than the 3 cents or 4 cents that they claim it's worth.
When you look at every history that I can find, or every society throughout history, where they had access to gold, or they found gold, or were introduced to gold from someone else's culture, it has had more than just a monetary use in a lot of cultures. It's been spiritual. special. It's been something about gold, and it's not even that it's the rarest thing in the world. If you look at some of the South American cultures, gold was not rare to them, but it was revered by them. Why? Why does gold have this pull across so many cultures, so many societies around the world? Why do you think?
I really don't. But first of all, I want to commend you for bringing me back on track, because you're absolutely correct. I mean, if you look at the religious objects throughout the spectrum, I mean, not just like the Catholic Church as an example. I mean, it's across the spectrum. The Mayans, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians. I mean, it goes on, and they do have this reverence for it. And why, I really can't answer, but I certainly agree with you. Maybe you can add some insight into that. But certainly, have used it in a quote unquote reverent type of a manner with spiritual objects, ceremonies, and we still do. I mean, if you look at the Olympics, I mean, what do you get? If you're the best, you get a gold medal.
Right.
What is it? It's gold. Why? Why are we doing that? Really. Right. I'm glad you brought me back on track.
Well,
you're right on.
Before we get too far into left field, now we got to go back to the practical and get to where we are, practically speaking, today. Because although there is a spiritual component to these things, as discussed, let's be honest, stackers and gold bugs are looking at that nominal value in dollars, aren't they? I mean, that's really where we are in 2014.
It absolutely is. And I've tried to make a paradigm shift to get people to rethink it. And it's very, very difficult. And I have trouble with myself, because everyone, when they think of their net worth, they look at, what their house is worth, what their stocks are worth, or whatever. And they equate it to how many, US dollars, or how many yen, or how many euros, or whatever they have. And on the metals side, what I've tried to instill into their consciousness is that if you're a stacker and you have more silver stacked this year than you had last year, you're by definition wealthier than you were before. Why? Because you have more ounces than you had the year before. But the price of them has gone down. And of course, people say, well, it's not worth as much, because if I have to cash them in, then it's worth less than what I paid. And I don't argue that point. What I'm trying to get across is that the units that you have are greater than the units that you had earlier. Therefore, you have more units, and those units are valuable. And the price is a moving target, certainly. But, if there's one thing that I want to make certain people understand, it's when silver and gold get overvalued, it may not be in paper terms. In other words, there might be, what's your target? Well, it's hard to put a target when you have a fiat currency that's worth 3 cents relative to what it was 100 years ago. You take an ounce of gold from 100 years ago, it's still an ounce of gold.
Well, but we need to be intellectually honest about something. Most of the people that are listening to your voice right now and have listened to me right now, they came to this game not when you did maybe 20 or 30 years ago, and not when I did 15 years ago. They did in about 2011. We know from reports from retailers, from the U.S. Mint, from the ETFs, we can look directly at the ETF volume, that most of the folks in this game now weren't buying when prices were undervalued. They were buying probably when you were selling and when I was selling. So to a lot of folks now, the rhetoric about wealth is kind of lost, because their paper nominal value has gone up in smoke in the last few years. What would you say to people who have had that nominal loss in dollars in the last 3 or 4 years just now coming to the game?
One, I'd acknowledge it. I wouldn't deny it. I think it needs full acknowledgement. Two, I think that the best thing for each individual to do is to take a deep breath and relax and ask themselves one simple question, and that is, why did they buy it in the first place?
But David, what if the answer to that question is a story which you or I would find to be total hokum? What if someone were to tell you, I bought silver because I was told the COMEX was going to default next week, and that was 3 years ago. Now, you and I both, I suspect, would not have bought for that reason. But what if that's the reason why they bought? Would you have them reevaluate that rationale, or would you say, go buy some more?
Well, I think they'd have to answer that for themselves. Certainly, they have to check their premises. I mean, if the premise that they bought it on was they were betting on what some guru said, and believe me, when I call myself the silver guru, I have my tongue really planted really hard into my cheek. I would say, look, the fundamental reason, the way I see it, is that every fiat currency has failed. And that's what we started your show with, Don. And if that's fundamental enough, then fine. If it's because someone said the COMEX is going to fail, then in my view, that's the wrong reason. And the other thing I think is that people get the silver story, the gold story, the honest money story, and they determine that they've got this great aha moment, and they overindulge. They jump in all at once, and they expect, since they know this fundamental fact that it's got to go up immediately. And that's not the way markets work. Even manipulated or not, that's not the way
markets work. And I want to stop here for a moment, because what you just said, if that was the only thing people heard you say in this conversation, that's the greatest thing you've said. You can believe whatever you want to believe, but if you push all your chips in the middle of the table, you might be out before the game is over.
Exactly. I've recommended 10% is correct for most people, and at the heat of the market, and I still recommend, if you're a gold bug, let's put that out on the table, then 20% is probably more than enough. But, people hear the story and they go, oh, this is great, and they jump in, and all of a sudden, and I've had many consultations over the years, Don, where people have called and said, I wish I would have listened to you earlier because I listened to so-and-so, and I've got, 80% of my net worth in silver right now, and I bought it at $32 an ounce. And now I don't know what to do. And I've always taught, that's why I put the 10 rules of silver investing out on the internet for free. I mean, way, way, way back, I used to charge some nominal fee for it. But I thought that wasn't doing a public service. I want to do a public service. So I put that out for free. I said, start small, dollar cost average, 10% is enough. I mean, there are all these things that are out there. Very simple, succinct 10 rules. And these rules could be applied to investing in general, but they're specific to silver. And that is something that I felt it was almost imperative to make certain that anyone that really, let's say, got over enthused could take, again, a breath and look and read and probably take, 5 minutes. But for example, the dealer thing, there's some shady dealers out there. And what I suggest is that when you get all enthused, then you take a small bite from the dealer of your choice and you find out how you're treated. In other words, how long does it take? Does the check clear? On and on. But people get, really wound up. I had an Oriental gentleman call me up, and his parents came from China, and they put roughly $500,000 into these quote-unquote semi-NUMI coins. And this is a scam in most cases. This particular one definitely was. So they paid about 40% premium on these coins, and they didn't know it. The salesman talked them into it. And he called me. Luckily, in a way, silver was at $7 the ounce after this took place, and I told him, well, certainly you paid way too much premium, but I'm relatively certain that silver is going to go well beyond $7, and then I made a recommendation of what I would do if I had that predicament. But that's the deal. You got to be careful.
David, I need to interrupt here because
sure.
You've said some things which your Q rating has now fallen through the floor with the stackers. You said, if I can quote you, that they need to think for themselves. What? Oh my goodness! And they need to not push all their chips in at one time, and that there are some shady dealers. Wow, I don't know, man. I think that your career as a precious metals guru is coming to a close here with this interview.
That was possible.
This may be the last one. Let me. I do have a whole bunch of questions. When I realized that we were going to have this conversation, in full disclosure, brokered by our mutual acquaintance Bill Murphy, I thought, well, I've got some questions I want to ask that you might not have heard before. So, and you've not heard any of these questions from me. So, do you mind if I just throw some questions at you?
Far away. Let's see what happens.
All right. I heard you in an interview talk the other day about Putin and gold. You seem to intimate a connection between Putin and a libertarian thought process of some sort. Now, you said that he's one of the guys who shoots straight on a few issues. Why do you think that Putin, whose own currency and economy are just disasters, seems to be so popular among libertarians and metal folks these days?
It seems, in my view, that he is able to stand up and just say something very succinctly on the world stage that very few, if any, other leaders are willing to do or have the guts to do. For example, when they had the G20 meeting, I guess the Prime Minister of Canada said, you've got to get everything out of Ukraine. You've got to leave Ukraine. And he said, well, that's impossible. We're not there. So I don't know what the truth is. I'm not on the ground to know. I'm not trying to take sides here, but it's a very interesting comment nonetheless. As far as the gold thing goes and their currency, this is something I'm putting in the new book in chapter 7, the last chapter, and that is beyond silver. No matter what political philosophy you are, everybody runs on a monetary system. Think about that. Where does the power really lie? Well, Don, I'm sure you and I know, and I don't want to speak for you, I just did, but it's the money system that has the power. Be communist, fascist, libertarian, anarchist, whatever stripe you are, the power lies with the monetary system. And that's something that most people never really wake up to. It's like, oh, I've got this ideology or I've got that ideology, et cetera, et cetera. And yet it is I was taught in 8th grade, money is power. And it really woke me up.
In the interview I'm talking about, you alluded also to that very concept when you talked about a one world currency, and you were asking a very, I think, pertinent question about, well, do we think that Russia or China are going to be able to sit out from that game? Why don't you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that, because I do have a question about one world currency I want to follow up with.
I'm absolutely not sure. I mean, if you look at what's going on, you could look at it two ways. The one way you could look at it is that the BRICS definitely want to opt out of the current system and make their own. They're doing their own clearing system. They're moving away from the SWIFT system. They're looking at trading in their own currencies. They're doing currency-to-currency swaps, circumventing the dollar. So you could say that they're removing themselves or trying to part away from the Anglo-American empire. On the other hand, you could say it's another global scale, good cop, bad cop, where you've got the normal paradigm where the controllers, the monetary elitists, are just giving you a big show to make you believe that you have a choice, when in reality you don't. And honestly, Don, I haven't made up my mind which one's the correct view.
Okay, so yeah, and that's kind of how I feel about it. That when I hear people talk about Putin or China, I'm fascinated by people's enamorment with these guys. When it's all, whether you believe Putin, you like Putin or not, you have to say that at a certain level of leadership, you and I have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. So we really don't know what they really want. But I do find it interesting that so many people will say gold then, no matter what any of these nations do, gold should be the standard. It should be the international settlement currency. One folk who's talked about that is Louis Lehrman at the Gold Standard Now. Are you familiar with Lehrman's work?
Slightly, yes.
Slightly, okay. Well, Lehrman on a one world currency has an interesting comment, and you can find this at his website. I'll read this to you real quick. He says, if we truly wish to rule out systemic financial disorder and currency wars and consequences of them, the great powers must rule out official national reserve currencies, then embrace the international gold standard as the official standard monetary unit and the sole reserve currency of an integrated and open world trading system. Now, I'm not going to ask you to speak for Louis Lehrman, but I do want your take generally on the idea of a gold standard. Are you in favor of removing all national reserve currencies in favor of just a one world gold currency?
I am not. There is a very good written piece on gold-eagle.com, and I think it's TNTALGA. I may have it slightly off as far as the spelling. And he writes, the gold-only standard is one step from fiat. In other words, he argues, and I would argue as well, that you really need a bi- or trimetallic standard where you have gold, silver, and, say, even copper as the monetary system. If you have a gold-only standard, that has always morphed into some kind of gold cover clause or whatever. And what do you measure it in? If it's only gold, what do you measure it against? Certainly you can measure it only in gold. I'm not saying you can't, but normally if you're only on a gold standard, you have more and more problems. And history bears that out. I'm a pretty deep thinker. But after reading his work and studying it harder, I came to the conclusion he's correct. And that is, if you look at what happened, let's say, when in the crime of 1873, when silver was removed from the monetary system, that was the banking elite, and they wanted it to go to a gold-only standard for a very specific reason. And the very specific reason is control. When you only have one metal as money, you have a lot more control. So I am much more of the mindset that you should have free market money, and that would be the market determining whatever it is. And if it was only going to be a one world, let's say, currency or monetary system, gold only, I would say no way. You want some checks and balances in the system itself determined by the market or the people. And the only way to do that, there's several ways to do it, but just talking on a precious metal standard, it would be a gold, silver standard or a copper, silver, and gold standard.
I give you high marks right there for mentioning copper, because the Coinage Acts of 1792 onward mention copper, silver, and gold. And it's funny that a lot of gold and silver retailers until recently had seemed to have forgotten about copper, that they were interested in gold and silver. And I posit that it had something to do with the margins they could make and the stories they could create to sell silver and gold that weren't so sexy with copper. But you're right, copper is absolutely, if you're going to have a metallic system, it's as far as the U.S. is concerned, You got to have it part of the system. But you seem to extend from gold to silver to copper, but you stopped short at any paper at all. Thomas Jefferson himself believed that paper wasn't the problem. It was that bankers who controlled the currency were the problem. Do you see any reason at all or any positives to having a paper currency system in place in any way?
Well, to be intellectually honest, a paper system could work, and I use the word could, not would. The problem is you've got that human factor in there. I mean, the magic of gold and silver is you can't print it. Whenever you have somebody in charge of that paper, that power seems to get abused. It always has. If we become enlightened, maybe we don't need to use a monetary system at all. I don't know. I've said that before. I've very seldom asked that question. I don't necessarily, the answer is the answer. Can it work? Yes. Has it worked? No.
Fair enough. And I agree with that. I think whenever I talk to someone about this issue and they remind me that they'll say, well, would you trust this Congress to come up with a monetary system that works or is good for the people or whatever? I say, no, I wouldn't. But I also don't trust the banks. I don't trust hardly anybody. But the one thing I would trust is if Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and if Article 1, Section 10, and if the Federalist Papers were ever actually followed, and if the writings of Jefferson were followed, then it might work. But I agree with you, has not to date. Now, you mentioned something the other day also about Zimbabwe. I love what you said about Zimbabwe. You talked about Zimbabwe, mentioning that you don't think we're going to have a Zimbabwe-type event in the West. Can you take a moment and describe why you don't think that can happen?
In advanced capital markets, and Zimbabwe didn't have this because it wasn't an advanced capital market, there's the bond market, and that's the debt markets that we all refer to. And the debt market has basically a governing function on it. The governing function is that as interest rates go up, bond values go down. And interest rates are kind of a barometer of the health of the economy. I'm old enough to have gone through the first bull market in the precious metals. And when Paul Volcker came on the scene and he threw interest rates up to 17.5% to 20%, depending on what short or long-term bond we're talking about, it definitely halted the markets. And I, being overstudied in the monetary system, made a bad choice at the time because I looked at it like this. I said, if we're getting 20% on the 10-year, that is a mafia loan. Yeah, it's not a function of reward. It's a function of risk.
Right.
If you got to put the money, if you got to put a loan up at 20%, it's the federal government's money or, debt that is doing this, I'm saying that's it. It could be imminent. This is a collapse scenario. And of course, I was dead wrong. And I doubt I'll make that mistake again. But think about what a 20% interest rate does to the bond values. It takes the bond values and puts them in the trash can. So all those people that were, what we call clipping coupons, had a very big wake-up call because the value of those bonds became worth a lot less. So that's why you can't really have a hyperinflation in an advanced capital market. There's this regulator on the bonds. But
no. I agree with you. What I'm saying is you're not going to see that. And the reason it's important.
You're not.
The reason it's important is because a lot of people are planning as if the Weimar Republic or Zimbabwe are around the corner, when in fact you don't need anything that spectacular. You can just have the mundane ass-kicking we've had in inflation for 100 years to still mean you ought to be battening the hatches.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think you're going to get very high interest rates. It's basically a psychological phenomenon, really. What it really is a distrust in paper money by enough people. And people say, oh, well, it's got to be the majority. No, it doesn't have to be the majority at all. It could be like 1 or 2% of the population that wakes up. It's actions in the market that are going to determine this. But it could be a bond trader in Japan that wants to move an off-size amount definitely different than they usually do. And it's not something nefarious. It's something that's like, we're going to off our dollar position rather heavily today. And then a Chinese bond trader sees that coming from Japan and says, I wonder what they're doing. They're getting out of the dollar. Look at that amount. I think I'm going to do the same thing. Well, all of a sudden, some Swiss banker sees that Japan and China are off in the dollar in a big way, and they press the button at the same time. So this thing could start in a rather innocent way, and all of a sudden, it starts feeding on itself. You got to remember, all these banks are interconnected. All these algorithms are similar, and a lot of people are kind of following what the other one is doing kind of thing. There isn't a lot of thought process. And the algorithms have caused problems systems already, the fat thumb or whatever it was called, and these type of things that do take place ought to scare the bejesus out of people, because these things are running the show a lot of the time. The black boxes are running the show at times. And these things might just go. And of course, there's circuit breakers in, which is more black boxes, saying, oh my goodness, the market crashed this much, stop trading.
Now, there's certainly a case to be made for those events, but the third world status, the Mad Max, people cannibalizing each other, that scenario, Mike Maloney has talked about gold will go to, and I'm using his language, I'm not asking you to defend Maloney either, but I don't even know what your relationship is with this guy. But I've heard Maloney say quadrillions of an ounce is where gold could go in a hyperinflationary event and all that. Do you need that sort of hyperbole to still construct a case on why people should own gold and silver?
Well, first of all, Mike and I go back a long ways, and we are friends, but I don't agree with everything he says. And, it's hard to put it out of context or in context. I mean, I think the point is, what is the value? And I would say an ounce of gold is in the same mass anywhere in the universe. What is the value that the markets want to give you, and how do you measure it? I mean, if you measure it in Zimbabwe, it's different than measuring it in U.S. dollars. I agree with you, Don. I don't see any hyperinflation in the U.S., and you don't need it, because the deterioration of the monetary system has already taken place in the last 100 years. We're arguing now what's going to happen to the last 3 cents of value. That's what we're arguing about.
What a great point you just made. It's so neat to hear you say that, because when I hear people talk to me about the collapse, I look at them and say, what part of 97% is not already a collapse? Like you're waiting for the next 50% of the actual 1%. You should have been thinking about this years ago. And this is not a new phenomenon. This has been happening for 100 years. Does it concern you when it comes to gold and silver that there does seem to be some central bankers around the world who seem to be enamored with gold? Robert Zoellick, former head of the World Bank, for example, said in 2010 that we needed a gold standard. Greenspan came out earlier this year and talked glowingly, just almost spiritually, about gold, to allude to what we talked about earlier. Is that a tell in some way? Is it a concern to you that these guys, or some of these folks, even some Goldman Sachs guys have talked about gold standard? Does that bother you in any way?
It does. It doesn't resonate wholeheartedly. In other words, going back to a previous question we discussed, Don, and thanks for these great questions. I am of the ilk that we need more than a gold standard. A gold-only standard scares me, to be honest. I would much prefer a trimetallic standard. I don't like, history has taught me that the gold-only standard is usually a road to a place you don't really want to end up.
Absolutely. And when I hear bankers, this may be the conspiracy side of me coming out, but when I hear a banker say they like something, I have to automatically check what it is I think I like. When you see people pontificate on gold and silver, there seems to be an emotional component. In fact, and maybe the theme of this conversation might be about emotions, but there's an emotional component, and people seem to gravitate towards people that touch their emotional hot buttons. Now, I try not to be that guy. I try to be the logical, rational guy. But who are the folks out there that you listen to that really get it right philosophically? And we could be talking gold and silver. We could be talking religion. We can politics, whatever. Who are the people that you resonate with, who lead you in a direction that give you kind of, hey, this guy or this gal, they're onto something?
Wow. I've never been asked that before. And if I could just move back into the martial arts, and I'm certainly a beginner there and not really doing the martial arts, just the health function. But to set the stage with Bruce Lee, and basically it's my understanding that he took from all kinds of disciplines and made it his own. In other words, he didn't adhere to any one exact way. He thought that there were multiple ways, and he took what he thought would be the best and the most useful from a practical standpoint, and that's how he integrated into his own form. So I would say that's probably how I have conducted myself. I mean, Harry Brown certainly had a huge influence on me. I got to spend, time with him physically before he died. Certainly his work, when he first said government doesn't work, I thought, what? What's he talking about? But of course, the more I read and the more I understood what he's talking about, I did start to understand more of the libertarian perspective. I'd say Jerome Smith, obviously the quote-unquote silver guru of the last bull market, certainly had a great staff that I think from all of the newsletter writers back in that era, back in the 70s and early 80s, probably had as intellectually complete a view of economics in the Austrian school of anybody that I'd studied. So certainly he had an influence on me, or more specifically, their writers. From there, going philosophically, stuff I'm looking at now, this Foster Gamble with the Thrive movement, certainly this guy has looked at almost everything. He's looked at crop circles, UFOs, how energy moves through the universe. A lot of things. He certainly looked at the banking system. I think that part of the Thrive movie that talks about the bankers is pretty succinct. I think it's very clear to most people that are unfamiliar with that part of what's going on in the system. So I'm trying to remain open-minded, Don. I really don't have all the answers. In fact, the older I get, probably the more questions I have. There are my betters, and that's both in the men and women. But I think on a philosophical thing, it's the passion that has always moved me. It's the Martin Luther Kings that are willing to stand up there and talk about a time when we can judge people on the character of themselves rather than the color of their skin. Now, that really resonates with me. Those type of things where people can stand up and tell the truth to the masses, that really brings it into the philosophical realm of these are human problems. They're not libertarian problems or democratic problems or Republican problems or women's problems and men's problems or gay rights problems. These are human problems. And we have to get back to the very basics that were basically the same regardless of all these orientations. And that's why I started on the monetary thing. Money transcends race, color, creed, all kinds of things, because everyone's concerned about their money. And if you really boil it down, it's not money per se, it's security.
That's right.
People want to be secure. And where does security start? And that's a philosophical question we can end with. Because in my view, this is, David talking for my 2 cents, it begins with understanding yourself at a very deep level. And there's many ways to get there. And of course, I'm still looking in a way, but I found a great deal. I have a lot to learn. These are very, very deep questions. And hopefully, I didn't go too far. It's certainly been one of the more interesting interviews I've ever done, Don. I commend you for dragging me into, let's say, the rabbit hole further than I've had to explain publicly in a long time, because these are the type of discussions I might have among close friends where I had a little more time to think. But you put me on my feet, and I really appreciate your time for asking me these type of questions.
Well, David, I appreciate you being here, and your answers are absolutely foundational to what people need to do. You concluded with exactly what I believe, and I also think it's neat to hear you talk about. I don't know how old you are. It's not my business, but I love the fact that you mentioned you're still learning, you're still growing. I did a video on this very topic the other day, that the older I get, I realize 2 things: the less I knew and how much more there's still left to learn. Anyway, I appreciate you coming on here. I hope a lot of people heard what you said. Just, they need to rewind and listen to all this, because you gave a lot of good information. Where can people find your stuff on the web? Where can people go to find out what you do?
The easiest and probably most popular is our YouTube channel, and that's Silver Guru on YouTube. Twitter feed is what I read every day, and I usually pick out the top 2 or 3 articles that I think are imperative to stay in touch with what's really going on. So that's at SilverGuru22 on the Twitter feed. The website is silver-investor.com, and there is a free once-a-week email letter that you can get for free. And if you want to go above and beyond that, because you really are into this sector, which means you're willing to pay something, we have 3 levels of service that's over on the right-hand side of the website, and they're described in the box on the right.
Right on. Well, David Morgan, thanks for being here. I hope it's not the last time you'll come on, and I also hope that next time we talk, we'll even delve a little bit deeper into some of these other issues. And thanks to Bill Murphy for connecting us. It's an honor to talk with you, David. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure, Don. Thank you.